today I'm joined by Liz Jackson with the Z, Liz, L-I-Z.
Yeah.
So tell me about what are you a philosophy professor? How does it,
Yeah.
what's your position?
So I'm a grad student at Notre Dame. I'm in my 5th year, and it's actually exciting. I'm about to defend my dissertation, so
Oh, awesome.
I'm getting close to being done. But yeah, so applying for jobs and all that stuff, and eventually the goal would be to be a philosophy professor, but it's also competitive and difficult. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Well, the interview today is actually brought in part by the Evangelical Philosophical Society. They were generous enough to provide this room for us to come in and do all these interviews, so that's been great. But then in addition to that, we also are in partnership with Defenders Media, and they provide media solutions for apologetic ministries. I think that's really cool. Well, let's get into the interview. So tell me about your background, like philosophy. How did you get interested in apologetics and faith, and whether faith is irrational, all of this stuff? How did you get your interest in it?
Yeah, so it's funny because I think I was always interested in philosophy, but I just didn't quite know it by that name.
Okay.
And growing up, I was always a very inquisitive kid with tons of questions. And I even remember specifically when I was about 10 or 11 years old, I just wrote down this list of all these questions I had about God and ethics and Christianity, and it's fun.
You wrote them down in a little book, or?
Yeah, like on a piece of paper.
Okay.
And I actually still have the list, and it's really interesting because I still have some of the same questions now.
Oh my gosh.
But it's, at a very early age, I was sort of thinking about these questions. And then I went to a Bible college to start off with. And when I was there, I was taking theology classes, and I really liked them, but I kind of felt like, man, I want to go deeper. I want to kind of question more of these assumptions. And this isn't to, hit on theology or anything, but I think there was these really fundamental questions I had that I wanted to explore. And so I was like, maybe I should try a philosophy class. And so I remember I took my first philosophy class, and it was actually social political philosophy, but I was sold. I was like, this is like what I've been interested in my whole life. This is so cool. And from then on, I was like, yep, I'm a philosophy major. I don't care what my parents say. I'm all in. And from there, grad school just kind of seemed like a natural option. So, yeah.
All right, well, let's get into the interview today, which is we're talking about faith and whether or not faith is rational, or whether the evidence, or with our faith, if the evidence can go beyond belief, what does that even look like? Is it still rational?
Yeah.
So tell me a little about faith and belief.
Yeah, so I think there are two main differences between faith and belief, and one is a little more controversial than the other. So the first that a lot of people kind of working on faith have noticed is that when you believe something, there's a lot of things we believe that we have no desire at all to be true. I believe I missed my flight. I believe there's terrible tragedies going on around the world, and it's totally normal and common to think we have beliefs that we have no desire to be true. But faith, on the other hand, one thing that makes it different than belief is a lot of people think when you have faith that something's true, that requires some kind of desire that it's true. So if I say, let's say you're running a marathon, and I'm like, Cameron, I have faith you're going to win this marathon, but I hope you lose. I hope you get last place. People think that doesn't make sense. You really don't have faith. So one difference between faith and belief is that faith has this desire component that belief doesn't.
Okay.
And then a second difference, which I think we'll get more into in the interview, but I'll just mention briefly, is that I think faith goes beyond the evidence in a way that belief doesn't. So people think, you could have good evidence that justifies belief, but if you get a good amount of counter evidence, then you shouldn't believe anymore. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people working on faith think, nonetheless, you could actually still have faith in that situation. And this might have a really surprising result. This is controversial, but that sometimes you can have faith even if you don't have evidence that quite is strong enough for belief. And so some philosophers have suggested this might be one way that faith can kind of go beyond the evidence. So
one thing in your work that I've noticed is interesting is the way that you define belief. So tell me a little about how you define belief, and then maybe define faith, or is the definition sort of built into these distinctions that you make between the two? How does that work? Maybe just the definition of belief, and then we can go from there. So
belief, I would say, is kind of a commitment to the world being a certain way.
Okay.
So if you believe it's raining, then you're sort of saying the world is such that it's raining. Whereas faith, I think, what kind of separates faith from belief is sort of those two components that I was talking about earlier. One is, I think, faith is consistent with more counter evidence you could still have rational faith even if you have counter evidence that doesn't justify you to believe. And the other is that desire component. So faith kind of requires a desire for the proposition to be true, whereas belief doesn't.
Okay, but faith is still something that you're like committing in the world. Like this is the way that you're living your life toward this ideal. Now, one thing that I find interesting about your work is that faith in apologetic conversations is normally defined as trust. So how would your understanding of faith differ from that, like a basic, or the more common way of defining faith in these apologetic conversations?
I mean, I'm pretty open to the idea that there is an important trust component to faith, especially when we're thinking about kind of like interpersonal faith or faith in God. I do, in my work, tend to focus on what's called propositional faith. So it's kind of faith that some statement or proposition is true. And so there might be cases where if you say like, I don't know, for some reason you say I have faith that it's raining, that might be weird to say I trust that it's raining. I mean, maybe you could say that. But I do focus on propositional faith, whereas trust might be kind of a more specific kind of faith, like faith in a person or faith in God. So,
okay, I like that. I like that. So the trust definition of faith is a little bit more narrow.
Yeah, potentially.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
One example that Dr. Tim McGrew gives is you're about to go jump out of a plane and parachute, right? You're not just going to jump out, but you're parachuting. And he says that even though you know that most people make it to the ground alive, and it's like 99 point whatever percent chance that you're going to make it to the ground alive and safe and everything, you're still putting your faith in this person. Would you say that falls more within the narrow definition of like the trust? Or does that, I guess that would actually fall into both, right? Because yours is more like you're committing your life in this one, at least in this one case, toward this direction of like, you're going to jump out of this plane.
Yeah, you could
right?
say,
So it'd be kind of both.
You could say you have faith that, you know, your parachute will hold you, or you have faith in the person that has sort of set up the situation that they know what they're doing. Or I guess sometimes you even parachute with someone with you, so you have faith that that person's going to make sure you don't, you know, die or something. So yeah, I think you could capture both the trust and the propositional elements of faith in that example.
Cool. So a little while ago you mentioned desire, like the role of desire in faith. And I also find that really interesting too, because when you were giving that example of like, I have faith that you're going to win this race, right? You have to desire in a sense that person is going to win. Otherwise it's just like, that's not really faith if you don't really desire for that outcome to be true. Tell me a little bit more about how desire plays into your theory of faith.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's interesting is, this might be surprising, but when it comes to belief, for example, there are cases where we can actually believe something, but we shouldn't act on our belief. So here's an example.
Okay.
Let's say I have a friend and I have pretty good evidence that her spouse is cheating on her. And the evidence is so good that I believe her spouse is cheating on her. But nonetheless, I shouldn't act on, if I'm not totally confident that that's true, I shouldn't act on that because of how, you know, what's at stake. It could potentially cause a ton of totally jeopardize their marriage if it's true. So I think there are cases where you believe something, but because you're not fully confident in that belief, you shouldn't act on it. But what's interesting about the faith case is that faith has both, it both requires a decent amount of evidence, maybe not as much as belief, but good evidence, and it has this desire component. And so because it has both of these components, which I think a lot of philosophers think those two components are the thing that justifies rational action. Rational action is sort of a combination of our beliefs and our desires. You can think about a basic example. You're hungry, you believe there's food in the fridge, so your desire for food and your belief result in you going to the fridge to get food.
And that's a pretty rational scenario.
Yeah, and that's like a common way a lot of people think about rationality, both like decision theorists, but also just sort of the basic belief desire people. And so because faith has both of these components, I think faith is actually going to require the person with faith to act on the propositions of faith even more than belief does. And so because belief doesn't have the desire component, but faith does, faith is going to be even more connected to rational action than belief.
That is so interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about the connection, if there is one, between belief and certainty, or faith and certainty. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so I think one thing some people might think is if you have faith that something, maybe there is some element of certainty there, and I just don't think that's true. I think a lot of times...
Well, let's talk about certainty itself.
Okay,
what is certainty? Like when people have I guess when I have like a conversation with my wife, like, are you certain that you're, I don't know, gonna wake up tomorrow morning? Some people say, yeah, I'm certain of that. But then I think there's a different level or a different type of understanding of what certainty is on the lay level versus like philosophy. So let's talk about just to get an understanding of what certainty is.
Yeah,
Maybe that'll be
that's
helpful
great.
too.
I think that's helpful. So certainty, at least as philosophers understand it, is like when something has probability 1.
Okay.
So it's like
And
a
tell me what that
very
is
high
too.
level. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's basically like there's no possibility or chance you could be wrong. And some philosophers, I mean, so paradigm examples of this would be like 2 + 2 = 4, or maybe the proposition that you exist. But some philosophers think even these propositions aren't beyond doubting because, it could be that Hume is right and you don't really exist, but there's just floating beliefs and desires and there's no self. Or Buddhists, they also think there's no self. And like Descartes says, it could be that there's an evil demon who's deceiving us about math. So some people think we actually can't be fully certain of anything. That's kind of an extreme view. But at the very least, the way that philosophers use the word, we're not certain of a lot of stuff.
Okay.
Even if in English we would say, I'm certain that this cup is on the table or whatever, a lot of philosophers think, no, we can doubt a lot more than we thought.
So what is certainty though? Is it like an attitude? Is it, I'm trying to think of like how it actually works and looks in like our lives and what certainty is. Because you also mentioned the difference between faith and confidence, or belief and confidence, right? Because you think that belief is like either on or off, whereas confidence levels can vary. So what is certainty? Is certainty more related to confidence levels, or is it related to like belief being on and off? What is your take here? I'm actually amazed at how many different distinctions and things that can be made here. It's really cool.
Yeah, it can get a little complicated because there is a lot of distinctions. But what actually my dissertation is it's on the relationship between belief and confidence.
Okay.
And so a word that philosophers use for confidence is this other word called credence. But I'm okay with just thinking about the word confidence. And so.
Okay. So certainty would have to do with confidence then.
Yep.
Okay.
So one way to think about what certainty is it's just like maximal confidence that something is true. You couldn't be more confident in that thing. And so then when we're sort of given these skeptical scenarios like, what if you are a brain in a vat, or what if someone's deceiving you about math, then that kind of primes the idea that there's very little we can actually be totally maximally confident in. And so, some way people think about confidence is just like a probability. So you can do 0 to 100 or 0 to 1. And so some people say confidence is like credence or confidence level 1. That's what certainty would be. So.
Okay. Okay. So would you say that, well, in the Christian life, it involves hope too. Would you say that hope involves uncertainty or certainty? What's the relation there between Christian hope and certainty?
That's a good question. I think, so looking at some of the literature, especially literature on faith and hope, some people kind of assume they're the same or very similar kinds of attitudes, and I actually don't think that. So I think oftentimes all you need to hope is you need there to be some chance of the hoped for outcome obtaining.
Okay.
So basically a non-zero probability
Okay.
is one way to think about that. And I think.
But what if that probability is 1, or you believe that probability is 1?
So it's interesting because we do say things like, I hope you'll make your drive home for Thanksgiving safely without getting in a car accident, or I hope you'll pass your test. And I think when we say those things, I don't want to assume that means like there's a very low probability that you'll pass your test, for example, if I say that to you. Is hope, so I guess I don't want to say that hope is inconsistent with some things being a relatively high probability. I do think it might be trickier to get cases of hope where the probability is like maximal, or where you're certain, like I hope that I exist. Well, that might not seem appropriate to say unless I've already sort of given you reasons to think you don't.
Yeah.
So I think at least in most cases, hope is probably not going to go along with certainty. I don't want to totally rule it out, but usually what we hope for is going to have a lower probability than that.
So going back to faith and certainty, so faith is not synonymous with confidence, right?
No.
Would you say? Okay, so then to have faith, you don't have to have certainty.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I actually think most cases of faith are things that we're not certain of. And I think a lot of people think, maybe the misconception that certainty is so important to faith is because they're kind of not acknowledging this desire component and how important that desire component is. And if we just think, like you act on things that you think are true, then maybe you would think like faith is something you should be really, really confident or certain in. But no, like what rationalizes action is both belief, or both the kind of epistemic confidence component and the desire component. So when I think when we hone in on this desire component of faith, we can see why we don't, like, having this like maximal evidence, that isn't even really as important as some people think, because the desire component is there. So
okay.
yeah.
Now, some Christians think that the Bible teaches that everybody has certainty about God's existence, and the people who think they don't are really just suppressing that truth. So what are your thoughts on this as a philosopher, or someone who's studying all this stuff and writing their dissertation on it?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I definitely think there's a sense in which, like, in an ideal world, everyone would know God and have a relationship with God. And so in that sense, like, that's definitely one sense in which that verse is true. I think one thing that would really be interesting to dive into is to explore what suppressing means in this context. Because I think one thing you might think when you just read the verse is that I'm always suppressing, the evidence for God or my desire for God myself. But I'm actually open to the idea that it could be that other people suppress God's existence for others. So my actions can make God more or less available to you. And so in this, there's this thing called the problem of divine hiddenness, which is like, if God existed, why wouldn't he make himself more obvious to people? But I think if we sort of understand suppressing, not just in I'm suppressing the evidence for myself, but maybe sometimes we suppress the evidence for each other, what we can kind of give is a sort of free will story about why God is hidden. God kind of gives us the free will to either help draw each other to him or not. And then we can kind of understand both the sense in which God is suppressed, but also why that verse is true, but also we experience this hiddenness. It's because God's given us the free will to sort of suppress him or not. So
earlier you were talking about faith as like something that is propositional, right? So what is it a mental state? Is it propositional? How do we think about faith as it relates to like what's actually going on in our brains with faith?
Yeah, so I think there's actually two really important and different senses of faith. One is faith as like a mental state, and in the same way that belief is a mental state, faith might be kind of a combination of a certain confidence level and a desire, that sort of thing. But in this sense, faith is kind of something in our brains.
Okay.
But there's another sense of faith that I think is also really important, and one that philosophers who are working on faith talk about, and that's faith as an action or a commitment to act. And so this kind of faith is interesting because I think it's actually consistent with a lot of different things kind of going on in your head, but nonetheless it's a commitment to act in certain ways. And so philosophers think what justifies things in your head versus what justifies acting in certain ways is different. And so I think kind of pulling apart these two senses of faith and then thinking about the rationality of each is actually really important.
Okay, so then faith as a mental state, how can that go beyond the evidence and yet still be rational? Yeah. And that's something that you're currently working on right now, right? So.
Yep, for sure. So in my dissertation, like I said, I talk about the difference between belief and confidence. Mm-hmm. And so one thing that philosophers thinking about this have noted is that confidence levels are very easy to change. I can give you a tiny bit of evidence and then you should be slightly more confident. Okay. And I can give you some counter evidence, you should be slightly less confident. And so confidence levels can kind of move up and down, but at least to a point, your belief is going to stay the same. So if I give you, some evidence that something's true, you might be moderately confident and then believe, then I give you even more, and your confidence will go up, but you'll keep believing.
Right.
And the same thing can happen with your confidence going down. And so there's a sense in which belief can actually be steadfast in light of these evidential changes. And some philosophers have noted this lately, and they say this is totally rational, this is just kind of the way that belief and confidence work. And so in one of my recent papers, what I suggest is faith actually does something pretty similar. Evidence will move our confidence levels up and down, but nonetheless, we can still have faith that something is true. And what's interesting is earlier in our discussion, I was sort of talking about how faith might go beyond the evidence even more than belief, and faith could be consistent with even lower confidence levels than belief. And so if you think this is right, then you can actually get a picture on which faith can remain steadfast, even though one's confidence levels are kind of going pretty all over the map. I mean, it's going to depend on how extreme you want to go, but I think you can at least get, you're getting evidence that moves your confidence up, moves your confidence down, but nonetheless, you can have faith and have rational faith. But there is some sense in which that faith is going beyond the evidence.
Okay, yeah, so we talked a lot about evidence, and
Yeah.
philosophers use that term in all sorts of different ways. Not only philosophers, but ordinary people. Right? I think the more common, like lay level understanding of evidence is something that's objective out there in the world, like a fingerprint on a gun, right? So what are the different kinds of evidence? And maybe that'll help us as we continue the conversation.
Yeah, so the basic way that I think about evidence is a probability raiser or lowerer.
Okay.
So evidence is something basically that just raises or lowers a probability. And so one thing to note about this is I can give you a very little bit of evidence for something. You ask a stranger on the street some question, they give you an answer. That could still count as evidence, even if it just raises the probability a tiny bit.
Okay.
So evidence, I guess in this sense, is sort of easy to come by because it just has to raise a probability by any amount. So that's kind of the way I generally think of evidence, at least as like a rough starting point. It might need some more refining, but I think that's a relatively common way. But the second thing to note that I think could be important is, yeah, I think you're totally right. When we use evidence in like an everyday sense, a lot of times we're thinking about kind of something objective, like evidence that someone committed some crime because of, like you said, like a fingerprint on a gun or something. But philosophers, I mean, they think that's evidence, but the way they think of evidence is in a more subjective way. So they kind of think each person has their own body of evidence, and from person to person, that evidence can actually be pretty different. But this is actually sort of a cool picture because it can kind of explain why we might disagree about something, but neither of us is irrational because we're just sort of following our evidence. So they do, I think philosophers tend to think about evidence a little more subjectively than maybe like the everyday person.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've already talked about faith as a mental state and how that can go beyond the evidence and be rational. We also talked about the other understanding of faith as a decision to act. So how can that still go beyond the evidence and be rational?
Yeah, great. I love this question because, again, I can talk about the importance of desire in our theory of faith. So what I want to begin is by noting that there can be cases where we think something is very unlikely, but nonetheless it's rational to act as if that thing is true. So one case I like to give is, let's say your sibling goes missing, and you have like some pretty good evidence that they're dead, but it's not fully conclusive. In this case, it can still be rational to act as if they're alive and to put up missing posters, to go and search for your sibling, to, do your best to try to find them, even though you have pretty good evidence that they're dead. And so the reason for this, at least one plausible reason for this, is because of your desires, because of how good it would be if they were alive and you found them. And so this shows that whether you should act as if something's true doesn't just depend on your being really confident that it's true, but it also depends on kind of what's at stake and the way your desires look. And so because of this, I actually think it can be rational both to kind of continue in your commitment to God and continue to participate in a religious community and go to church and pray, even when your confidence levels get relatively low. And I also think maybe even more controversially, people that didn't have that commitment in the first place, they can make that commitment even if their confidence level that God exists or that some religion is true isn't super high, but that can be rational because of their desires. Because I think if God existed and I did pursue this relationship with God, that would just be such a good thing that it's worth it for me to make this commitment, even though I don't have very high confidence that God exists or that Christianity is true. And so, again, like I was saying earlier, this is kind of becoming a theme in our interview. The desire component of faith actually plays a really important role, especially kind of in this acts of faith sort of understanding. How can these acts of faith be rational, even with a lot of counter evidence or when your confidence levels are low?
So when you talk about this with other philosophers, what is like the biggest objection they raise to your theory about how desire is sort of what makes it rational to go beyond the evidence? Is there like a common objection that they bring up, or are they just kind of skeptical about it? What's like the general response they give?
You say this because I was kind of thinking about, there is this objection there that some people have actually been making recently. So when people first started talking about faith, I think it was just kind of taken as a datum that faith has this desire component. I still think most people think that. But lately, a couple people have been sort of trying to challenge this idea. So one example that people give is you might have like faith that God is a Trinity, but have like no desire at all for God to be a Trinity and not really care. And you're just like, I just have faith it's a Trinity, but like, going either way, I don't have a strong desire for it. So people have been trying to sort of give cases where they think maybe you could have faith without desire.
Okay. So it wouldn't be a necessary condition for faith.
I don't know if I'm totally convinced. In some of these cases, like that case, for example, I think sometimes we just use the word faith to kind of indicate belief in a religious proposition, but that might not be the sense of faith that kind of I'm talking about.
Okay.
So I think there are kind of things the person who wants to insist that no, desire is a necessary condition for faith, there are responses they can give to this objection, but it is worth noting this is somewhat controversial and some philosophers have been challenging.
Couldn't you say that in most cases you have this desire component, and so that maybe there are some cases where it doesn't hold, but in most cases it does? Is that like a something that you've looked at as a possible
Yeah,
response?
I think that could definitely be a fallback. And then you could at least get, in a large majority of cases, action-oriented faith is still gonna be consistent with these low credences. And of course, like, even setting that aside, it's not gonna be that it's always gonna be rational for everyone, to act as if these things are true, because it is gonna depend on each person's beliefs and desires and
the situation.
And the situation, yeah. And some people might genuinely think that the probability that God exists is 0. And there's not a lot you can say to that person, at least in this framework. Maybe you can try to give them arguments to raise the probability or something.
So what are the most common ways that people object to faith and say that faith is just either inherently irrational or people that have faith are irrational, and then how do you respond to that?
Yeah, so I have a paper where what I basically do is I try to give this argument that some people make. I'm kind of thinking of the new atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, but also I think maybe people that object to faith generally might make an argument something like this. And so the argument goes like this. Premise 1 says faith is always or almost always irrational. Premise 2 says that most religious believers have faith. And then premise 3 says, therefore, all or almost all religious believers are irrational. And then what I try to do in this paper is I try to say, well, let's think about what faith might be. And let's look at a couple different candidates for faith. And then I try to argue based on those candidates, either premise 1 is going to be false, and it's not going to be true that faith is irrational, or premise 2 is going to be false. It's not going to be true that most religious believers have faith.
Okay. Is there a way that they typically try to defend that first premise, that faith is always or most probably irrational?
I mean, I think part of it is, it is sort of based on these different definitions that they give of faith.
Okay, so like one definition is that like faith is just pretending to know something you don't know.
Exactly, great. That's actually the first definition. So excellent. So,
Which is actually put forward by an actual philosopher, Peter Boghossian.
Oh, I didn't know
right?
that.
Oh yeah, he wrote it down in his book, A Manual for Creating Atheists.
Oh, nice. Yeah. So there's also the more kind of colloquial thing that. So who says faith is believing that you know what you know ain't so?
That was. I have his face in my mind.
I know, I'm forgetting who it was, but a lot of people.
Mark Twain.
Mark Twain, thank you. Yes, a lot of people sort of also quote that as kind of like a way of understanding someone that might make this claim, although I don't know if that was like in a philosophical context. But
it seems like it's just semantic, like they just define faith as irrational.
Yeah, exactly. So the thought is, well, look, if you want to say faith is just like when we believe irrationally or we believe like totally out of accord with what our evidence or our epistemic situation, calls for, okay, sure, like if that's what you're saying faith is, then faith will be irrational. But then I want to hear more about why you think most religious believers have that. And so I think that's sort of where this kind of argument is going to fall short.
I see.
Because, you can say faith is this thing, but then you need some kind of story about why all these religious believers are believing totally out of accord with their evidence. And
that makes sense because you were saying that like depending on how you look at faith, either premise 1 is going to be false or premise 2 is going to be false.
Yeah.
And premise 2 was that most religious believers have this kind of faith. So if you define faith as irrational, then you'd be like, well, what evidence is there that premise 2 is true?
Yeah.
Right?
And I think, too, one thing that's interesting is a lot of epistemologists of religion, Plantinga is one, maybe even Swinburne, have argued, given very serious arguments that religious believers aren't irrational in this way. And so I think whoever's making this argument is going to need to engage with that and kind of show why those arguments are wrong. And one thing that's kind of interesting about at least Plantinga's arguments, for example, is he thinks you can actually totally rationally have faith or believe in God without even having some kind of philosophical argument to back it up. So I think there's been some interesting kind of epistemology on what it takes for faith or belief in God to be rational that kind of the person working with this definition of faith would need to at least respond to or interact with in some kind of way. So
okay, so that was one way that you respond is to look at like the way that they're defining faith and then show that, hey, premise 2 is actually false on this understanding, or there's really no reason to believe it.
Yeah.
So the other way that you mentioned is that you actually analyze a few different ways that we can think of faith, and we've already been talking about that during the interview. So let's go through a couple of those and see how then premise 1 would be false on sort of these different understandings of what faith is.
Yeah. So at one point, Sam Harris he suggests what faith is. It's some kind of self-justifying attitude. And from that, he concludes that it's irrational. But I want to say, wait, let's step back.
Self-justifying attitude? What is that?
Yeah, so the way that I understand a self-justifying attitude and the way that philosophers, including William James, have thought of this is it's actually, one way to think about it is like a belief that creates evidence for itself. And so one example William James gives is you're on a hike and you're lost in the middle of the forest. And you have no idea how to get home. And then finally you're like, oh, I figured out this is the path to get back to civilization or whatever. But on that path, there's this huge crevice. And the crevice is wide enough that you're not sure you'll make it, but not too wide that you're like, there's no way I'm going to make this. It's kind of in that in-between, area. And so William James says, look, if you cultivate the belief you're going to make the jump, that belief could give you kind of energy and zeal that makes it more likely you'll make the jump. And so that's kind of like a self-justifying attitude. It's a belief that creates evidence for itself. And there's other examples too, like believing you'll survive a really tough surgery could make it more likely you'll survive, or believing you'll win a basketball game might make you play harder and make it more likely to win. So these self-justifying attitudes are something that philosophers talk about.
Okay.
But what puzzles me about Harris's claim is that he says faith is self-justifying, therefore it's irrational. But it's not really clear that these, at least self-justifying in the sense that these philosophers are thinking of, it's not clear that they would be irrational because they're creating evidence for themselves. I mean, they're self-justifying, right? So what I want to say here is, look, if this is your definition of faith, it's not really clear that it's irrational. Also, when you think about at least faith in God, it's kind of unclear that this is something a lot of people, like having faith that God exists isn't going to make it more likely that God exists. So
Right.
I don't know if this is going to apply to religious faith, but I do think it could apply to interpersonal faith. So again, let's go back to the marathon running thing. If you're running a marathon and I say, Cameron, I have faith you're going to make your time, that could give you, more confidence and more energy that would make it more likely you would make your time. And so I actually think this might be an interesting way that we could think of faith, that it does have this unique relationship to evidence, but it's also not irrational. But again, this would be more interpersonal faith, not necessarily religious faith.
Okay, so what's another understanding of faith, and how is that still rational?
Yeah, so another one would be faith. Faith is something that you don't inquire into. And so the thought would be, since religious believers don't inquire into the things they have faith in, then they're irrational. And so in response to this, I guess two things. So first, it's worth noting there's a lot of things that we believe and believe rationally without inquiring into them. So let's say you're like, hey, I'm like, hey, what'd you eat for breakfast? You're like, hey, I had eggs. And then I believe you. And I don't go and check your hotel to see if they served eggs this morning, or see if there's eggshells in the trash or whatever. I just believe you, and that seems totally fine. So it seems like there's a lot of beliefs where we can just believe them and we don't have to inquire into them. And so then the new atheist might say, well, religious belief isn't like that, or faith is something you should inquire into. But the other thing to note is I do think that religious believers, to an extent, do inquire into their faith, and they look for at least certain kinds of evidence for it. It might not always be a philosophical argument, but remember, evidence is anything that raises or lowers the probability of something. And so in terms of testimony and religious experiences, these are evidence that religious believers seek. So what the challenge is going to be for this person who says faith is irrational because religious believers don't inquire into their religious commitments or whatever, they're going to have to put the bar at a place where it wouldn't mean that these everyday beliefs, you telling me you had eggs for breakfast, we want to say that those are rational. So you can't have it, too high. But if you put it too low, then the inquiry that religious believers engage in is going to make them rational too. And so I just think it's going to be really difficult to put this bar at the right place that's going to rule in a lot of our everyday beliefs, but also rule out religious faith.
Okay, so we've looked at the self-justifying understanding of faith, and then this one was
the inquiry, lack of inquiry is the problem.
Lack of it, yeah, you're not looking into it. far enough, maybe you should, whatever.
Yeah.
All right, so do we have any more that you've looked at?
So there's basically two more, and both have to do with evidence. So the first is, we kind of touched on in the last one, but basically the thought is, well, the problem with faith is it's just not based on evidence. And there's a doctrine that's, I think, pretty popular among philosophers called evidentialism, which basically says if your beliefs are not based on evidence, they're irrational. So let's just say that's true. Let's say if a belief or even maybe faith is not based on evidence, it's going to be irrational.
See, here I still think that the definition of evidence is going to be so important.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because evidence I know that philosophers also make the distinction between like non-propositional evidence, which is like a kind of seeming that you have that something is true. That can still count as evidence. A lot of philosophers see that as evidence. So.
Good. So that's basically a big part of my response. No, that's great. So the thought is, well, look, it just isn't true that most religious believers' beliefs aren't based on evidence. If evidence is as broad as at least a lot of philosophers are thinking of it, this thing that raises or lowers the probability, then they do have a lot of evidence for their beliefs, even if it's religious experience or from reading scripture or testimony of other people, that kind of thing. And
a real common example that people give of like this non-propositional evidence is just looking around and looking at this table that's right next to us or the chair that I'm sitting on. All I got to do is see it, experience it, and that's like some kind of evidence for me that this chair actually exists. Yeah. Right? So to put it in a non-religious context, like we don't always have to look at it religiously, but
yeah, and like I said earlier too, it's not like I need to give you like a very like compelling premise conclusion argument that this table exists or this chair exists. You know? It just seems to you that way and you believe it, and we do this all the time, and that seems perfectly rational. And so some people think that's kind of what belief in God is like. The seeming that God exists, at least it counts as evidence that God exists, and some people even think that that's enough to justify a belief that God exists. But at the very least, the idea that religious faith is not based on evidence, that's not going to be true. Yeah. So we're going to have to reject that premise of the argument. But I think this could lead you to a response, which I think especially new atheists, but maybe other people skeptical of faith would make, which is kind of my final definition of faith. And so what they would want to say is, well, this kind of evidence isn't good evidence, especially if you think about testimony from a religious leader or an experience of God. That's not the kind of evidence that justifies epistemically good beliefs or attitudes. So a lot of these people, they really like science and they really like scientific evidence, or what might be called empirical evidence. So empirical evidence is kind of like scientific evidence, but it's a little broader. It's kind of evidence we get by studying the world around us. And so I think the final sort of definition of faith I consider is the idea that faith is irrational because it's not based on scientific or empirical evidence, and that's the problem. And so on this understanding of faith, I think it could be the case that some religious believers do have scientific or empirical evidence. One common example is the fine-tuning argument, which we don't have to go into, but there is some scientific evidence for faith. But, it might not be that a lot of religious believers are aware of that, or they don't have scientific evidence for their faith. So the problem with this definition of faith is that I just don't think a belief has to be based on scientific or empirical evidence to be rational. There's a ton of examples of this too. So beliefs about math or logic, those are often not taken to be based on scientific evidence, but those are actually indispensable to science. And
those are assumptions.
Scientific practice. Yeah.
They're assumptions you bring into science.
Exactly.
Logic and math.
Yeah, and even induction, which is the assumption that the future is going to be like the past. That's also an assumption that's kind of indispensable to scientific practice, but it's not necessarily based on empirical evidence. So
the claim itself too, right?
Yeah. Exactly, good. So then the claim that for an attitude to be rational, it has to be based on empirical evidence, that claim itself would not be justified by scientific or empirical evidence because it's a claim about epistemic rationality. So both claims about epistemic rationality, but even like a lot of moral claims that killing is wrong or rape is wrong, those are also, most people think, not based on scientific evidence, but based on some other kind of philosophical or what's called a priori evidence that doesn't come from studying the world around us, but comes from before experience is kind of what a priori means. So it comes, you kind of learn about it like via thinking or some other method, but not via like doing a scientific study. So the issue with this definition is it's just not true that a belief you have to have scientific evidence for a belief for it to be rational.
It's just completely false.
Yeah. And
defeats itself too.
Yeah, and it's self-defeating. So the premise that says faith is well, faith is irrational because it's not based on scientific evidence is not going to be true.
Yeah.
So, I mean, of course, this conversation we've just had, it's not conclusive because there could be other definitions of faith that would make it such that faith is something that is irrational and had by most religious believers. But I don't know what that would be, and I think kind of the burden of proof is on the objector to give a story about faith. And I'm pretty pessimistic about the project, so yeah.
So if I asked you if belief in God could be rational without arguments, your answer would be?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty plausible. I mean, there's a lot, when you use the word kind of like reformed epistemology, that could be a loaded term with a lot built in, but I think at least the idea that Flanagan talks about, we believe other people exist just by experiencing them, we don't have these robust arguments for them, and why can't belief in God be similar? And I'm pretty sympathetic to that. So yeah, I don't think you need a robust philosophical argument in order to be justified.
So what paper did you present at the conference?
Yeah, so
this
that
time,
because
you were talking about Pascal's Wager, and
which I actually think isn't totally unrelated to faith, but it wasn't necessarily specifically on faith. And so what I was doing was I was sort of talking about this other view in epistemology that people have, and that is called epistemic permissivism. And so basically what epistemic permissivism says is it says that sometimes for certain bodies of evidence, you could both, believe God exists or believe God doesn't exist, and either one could be rational for you. So your evidence is kind of permissive. Rationality leaves open what you ought to believe or underdetermines it. And so I was trying to argue, well, look, if this is true, this actually could have really interesting implications for Pascal's Wager, because both people think, I guess, two objections to Pascal's Wager. One is that wagering is just impossible because you can't control your beliefs. And then two is that wagering is irrational because if you form a belief not because of evidence, but because it would be really great if this belief were true or something, like it's kind of like a wishful thinking sort of thing. If you form it on the basis of a practical reason, then that seems irrational. And so there's the impossibility objection and the irrationality objection. And so what I tried to argue in this paper is that if permissivism is true, especially about theism, and if a lot of us are in a permissive case where either we could be atheist, agnostic, or theist without compromising rationality, or even just agnostic or theist. Some people don't like all three attitudes being permitted, but maybe just two. So if we find ourselves in either of those cases, then these two arguments for Pascal's Wager are going to fail, and actually fail in a very interesting way, because the previous responses to these objections are good, but I think if permissivism is true, we can even give stronger objections, responses to these objections, I mean. So with the first thing, a lot of people have argued that if you find yourself in a permissive case, you actually have a lot more control over your beliefs than if you don't. Because if your evidence just sort of says, like, you ought to just believe in God or something, it's a lot hard, like, how are you going to, change that belief? Your evidence kind of, determines that one attitude. But if your evidence, leaves it open, then it seems like your beliefs are much more up to you, in a sense. So a lot of people have said, look, if permissivism is true and you find yourself in a permissive case, we're going to have a lot more control over our beliefs than we might have thought. So that's sort of the first response. And then the second response is, look, if you find yourself in a permissive case and multiple beliefs are left open for you without compromising rationality, then you could believe one for a practical reason and nonetheless be rational, because kind of by definition, that's the case you're in, right? So it's really interesting because if epistemic rationality leaves open which belief you should have, then it seems totally fine to pick one for a practical reason, because kind of the epistemic is already permissive. So
very interesting.
Yeah, this is very different than the faith stuff, or at least, not obviously exactly related, but yeah. So I think it's interesting to think about kind of how certain insights from epistemology can give us these cool results in philosophy of religion.
That's really cool. Well, we'll have to have you back on to discuss some more about Pascal's Wager.
I would love that.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Well, this interview has been awesome, Liz. It's been great to meet you and to discuss faith and rationality. This is one of the things that I think about a lot. So it's been great to have you on Capturing Christianity.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Awesome.
Awesome.